let's get to the meat of these new California Association of Realtors forms.
This is Kasama Lee, your community realtor.
This week, we're going to dive into the buyer-broker agreement. So when you're a buyer and you're hiring a real estate agent, these are the components and the forms that you should be paying attention to. I'm going to do a screen recording of explanation of the different parts of the component of the form. So get ready, get your glasses on because you might need them. And before we begin, I want to make sure that you understand, here's a disclaimer for you. I am not a real estate trainer. I am a real estate agent. And what I'm sharing with you is based on our work and our practice in the field and in how we would explain it to our clients. Now, it's important that you, if you're a buyer and you're working with a real estate agent, for you to really take the time to fully read the forms. These forms are authored by California Association of Realtors, so the language is set. What I'm going to do is kind of taking you through the variables, the part that you should really pay close attention to. I would advise you to speak to your real estate agent so that they can fully explain the entirety of the documentation to you. If this content you find valuable, you want to hit subscribe and the bell notification so you don't miss future videos. Because next week, guess what we're going to do? We're going to dive into another side of the forms. You guessed it, we're going to be talking about what the sellers would be looking at with these new CAR forms that have been in effect since August 2024. Let's dive right into it. According to National Association of Realtors, here is what the settlement means for home buyers. You will sign a written agreement with your agent before touring a home. Before signing this agreement, you should ensure it reflects the terms you have negotiated with your agent and that you understand exactly what services and value will be provided and for how much. The buyer agreement must include 4 components concerning compensation. A specific and conspicuous disclosure of the amount of rate of compensation the real estate agent will receive or how this amount will be determined. B, compensation that is objective. For example, $0, X amount flat fee, X%, X hourly rate, and not open-ended. For example, it cannot be buyer-broker compensation shall be whatever the amount the seller is offering to the buyer. C, a term that prohibits the agent from receiving compensation for brokerage services from any source that exceeds the amount or rate agreed to in the agreement with the buyer. And D, a conspicuous statement that broker fees and commissions are fully negotiable and not set by law. In addition, you must have written agreements apply to both in-person and live virtual home tours. You do not need a written agreement if you are just speaking to an agent at an open house or asking them about their services. The seller may agree to offer compensation to your agent. This practice is permitted, but the offer cannot be shared on a multiple listing service, MLSs, or local marketplaces used by both buyer brokers and listing brokers to share information about properties for sale. You can still accept concessions from the seller, such as offers to pay your closing costs. This practice has gone into effect since August 17, 2024. Here's what the settlement doesn't change. Agents who are realtors are here to help you navigate the home buying process and are ethically obligated to work in your best interest. Compensation for your agent remains fully negotiable, and if your agent is a realtor, they must abide by the Realtor Code of Ethics and have clear and transparent discussions with you about compensation. When finding an agent to work with, ask questions about the compensation and understand what services you are receiving. Last and most importantly, you have choices. Work with your agent to understand the full range of these choices when buying a home, which will help you make the best possible decision for your needs. All right, so there are 2 forms that I'm gonna really dive in with you, okay? The first one, this is a new form since the change in August 2024. It's called Broker Compensation Advisory. This gets shared on the buyer side and the seller side as well. So it talks about listing agreement compensation is fully negotiable. This is very important that this gets stated, okay? And it was there before, but now because of the NAR settlement, the language is even more spelled out, okay? Optional additional compensation if the buyer is unrepresented. A listing agreement may include optional additional compensation amounts owed to the seller's broker for situations where the broker takes on additional responsibilities or workload. Sometimes a buyer may not be working with nor want to be represented by a real estate broker. Now, I don't know why that would be the case. It's a huge liability, in my opinion, that a buyer would be unrepresented, and who's representing them? Are they representing themselves? Do they know what forms to use? Do they have access to the forms? I'm not really sure if this is a healthy option for any party involved. That's just my personal opinion as a disclosure, okay? But because the additional work that may be required by the seller's agent to facilitate this unrepresented buyer, there may be additional work involved. In those situations, the broker is advised to use a buyer non-agency form, which is a different other form, and there may be additional compensation pre-negotiated due to the seller's agent if this is the case. All right, so broker may present both buyer and seller. This is called dual agency. Now, you can read through this, okay? But basically, this could be, for example, a buyer that the listing agent basically is the agent representing the seller. Maybe the buyer is someone that they had been working with prior to taking on this listing. So it was already their client, right? So it's possible that the agent ends up representing both parties. In our definition, Remax Gold is quite a large franchise brokerage. And even if there's another agent from Remax Gold that represents the buyer on the other side, that's also considered dual agency. It's perfectly acceptable. Broker agreements with buyers. Buyer representation compensation is fully negotiable when a buyer enters into a representation agreement with the broker. The buyer authorizes the broker to locate properties for the buyer to buy and agrees to pay the buyer's broker if a transaction is completed. Compensation amounts are not fixed by law and are fully negotiable. When negotiating compensation, the parties may discuss factors such as the broker's expertise and experience, the type of broker's services to be performed, and the broker's time and expenses, among other considerations. Requirement for written agreements. Pursuant to a nationwide class action settlement that you may have heard about, participants in multiple listing services are required to have a written agreement with the buyer prior to showing a buyer residential property or giving a buyer a tour of such a property. The agreement must identify the amount of compensation to be paid to the broker for services provided and require that the broker cannot receive any compensation in excess of the amount specified in the agreement. In other words, the broker cannot be working a little side additional compensation outside of what is stated in the buyer-broker agreement, okay? And we're going to see that next form in just a little bit. Pursuant to legislation expected to become law in California on January 1, 2025, all licenses showing a buyer any type of property will be required to have a written agreement with that buyer prior to the showing. So we now, at least, at Remax Gold, we are now required to have the representation agreement signed with the buyer before we can even show the first property, okay? And that's also in our local area. Advantages for written agreement. Buyers and their brokers benefit when terms of their relationship and respective duties are in writing upfront, right? A written agreement establishes a clear mutual expectations and helps avoid misunderstandings over the buyer and broker's duties and the amount of compensation the buyer's agent is to be paid. In other words, no surprises, right? When enlisting a real estate broker to represent them, buyers agree to pay the buyer's broker when escrow closes, but the person responsible for payment may be negotiated in the transaction. Ladies and gentlemen, this is where you need to pay close attention, okay? Yes, buyer pays the compensation pursuant to a buyer representation agreement. A buyer's broker may negotiate the amount of compensation directly with the buyer and then document that agreement in a buyer representation agreement. The buyer then becomes contractually obligated to pay the broker by providing funds to escrow prior to the closing of a transaction. This is where the room of negotiation is and where the funds could be coming from, okay? 3B, seller pays the compensation. Buyer negotiates for seller to compensate buyer's broker. A buyer may make a conditional offer to the seller by including a term in the purchase offer asking the seller to pay the buyer's broker if the buyer has already agreed to pay their own broker pursuant to a buyer representation agreement. If such a term is included in the purchase offer, the request will become one term among many that the seller may accept, reject, or negotiate by way of a counteroffer. Okay, so don't get overwhelmed with all these words, okay? All it means is that the compensation to the buyer broker needs to be written in as an attachment to the offer. And whether it's a flat fee, whether it's a percentage, the seller can negotiate through a counteroffer of that request. That funds then become funds that would get paid or compensated out to the buyer broker at close of escrow. That's the big change in the process, okay? In other words, the seller has the right to consider and negotiate what the buyer broker compensation would be upfront. Okay? When the offer gets submitted, of course. Buyer's agent negotiates an agreement directly with seller. If a seller is unrepresented or does not have an exclusive agency relationship with other broker, a buyer's broker may approach the seller asking the seller to sign an agreement. This basically speaks about for sale by owners, when we say unrepresented, the seller does not have representation. It would be a direct negotiation by the buyer's agent to the seller directly. That's 3B2, okay? And that's pretty much the meat of the broker compensation advisory. All right, let's dive into buyer representation and broker compensation agreement. So this is a new form, okay, that is now required. All right, this has to be part of the package of the offer. Okay, so this information is pre-filled. That's my office, right? Basically, the buyer has to sign this buyer representation and broker compensation agreement before seeing the first house. Okay, representation period. This could be a period that works best, mutually agreed between the buyer and the agent. Okay, that's on the listing side, we have a listing agreement period. This is representation period. Okay, so it can actually expire and it can be extended. All right, type of representation. Typically, it's an exclusive, okay, representation. Property type, so you would type in, it defaults to single family resident, right? If it's a multifamily, then you need to check that. 2 or 4 units or 5 units more, and so on and so forth. Location, what county, right? And we pre-filled it as Napa and Solano, which is where we specialize in. So here, if any additional details about the property would be disclosed here. E, broker compensation. Notice the amount or rate of real estate commissions is not fixed by law. They are set by each broker individually and may be negotiated between buyer and broker. E1 4B, amount of compensation. This is where the percentage could be put here, 2.5%, okay? Or if any, it could be a flat fee, a dollar amount. So this is what the buyer would be signing as reviewing it, agreeing with their agent, okay? Payments received by broker from seller or others. If broker receives compensation from seller or others for broker's compensation of buyer, the amount shall be credited against buyer's obligation to pay broker. So this is where the funds would be coming by seller compensating, okay? Continue, and this part would have to be written into the offer. Continued right to payment for broker involved properties. Continuation period shall be 90 calendar days after the representation period has expired, meaning if the work was done during the agreement period, representation period, and should a transaction come together from that seller with this buyer, the broker would still be compensated because the initial work was done during the period, okay? Cancellation, basically the agreement, the way we work with our clients, they can cancel anytime. There is no point in forcing people to stay with you because of the paperwork. And the goal is that we do such great work that they would want to stay with us, right? Other financial considerations: buyer does not have sufficient funds to pay broker. Buyer intends to purchase with the following loan product, which does not allow buyer to pay compensation to broker, okay? For example, like a VA loan. Broker's compensation advisory, which is this form that you saw earlier, right, that we just went through, okay, is attached to it. And I think that's the most important part that I want to make sure that you understand, that this form needs to be signed before you can go look at houses with your agent. Very important. All right, I hope this is helpful. Thanks.